So there we go.
Okay.
Bonus episode, Sense and Sensibility.
Yeah.
This is the one where we're going to talk about the secondary criticism in the
Right.
back of the Norton, the very well put together Norton Critical that we read. And I should say I brought some notes, as you can see.
Yeah.
Although I feel like I have a relatively limited sort of
Yeah.
contribution planned.
Yeah.
But and I suppose there's no rule that says this one has to go as long as the other ones. But I am curious to see what you have to think. And see if you have. I definitely have a favorite from today's reading, and I'm curious to see how that lines up with you. And I'm curious to see if any of this has changed your sensibility about Sense and Sensibility.
Yeah, those are good. Those are good questions. This is from, I guess, for context, because there have been other editions. This is the 2002 Norton edition, edited by Claudia Johnson. And the two parts, I guess, that were on the table today loosely were the sections labeled context and the section labeled criticism. The context stuff I tried to dive into and just couldn't do. But I get the impression that what Johnson is doing there is trying to, you have like Adam Smith, Samuel Johnson, Edmund Burke, Thomas Paine. So there's a new historicist vibe. There's also stuff from like Hannah More and Mariah Edgeworth. So you get some like epistolary and also literary context. And I think part of what's going on in there is Johnson's effort to sort of complicate the way we understand what those words, and especially what the word and the idea of sensibility meant at the end of the 18th century. The way that we read the word now as a literary device, as a philosophical or political disposition, may not be the same as what Jane Austen grew up hearing. So even though I didn't dive into those, I did pay a special attention to something Johnson said on Roman numeral 10 in her introduction that I reread before reading the criticism, which I read all that. And she says very early in her intro, she says, she wants to challenge this idea of, even though the title is Sense and Sensibility, that a lot of critics kept reading it as sense versus sensibility. And so she says, generations of critics have based their readings on the novel on a misapprehension of the title, and as if the titular conjunction were, as Margaret Doody has observed, versus rather than and have held that the purpose of this novel is to depreciate sensibility and recommend sense rather than to explore their shared vulnerabilities. Right. And so I thought, the criticism part did a pretty good job of exploring the shared vulnerabilities. And while I'll just say one more thing and then let you run, I didn't necessarily have a favorite, but the treatment by Mary Poovey reminded me a lot. Mary Poovey article called, or I guess it was from a chapter title in a book that came out in 1984. Her title is Ideological Contradictions and the Consolations of Form, Sense and Sensibility. She had some things to say about the novel's purpose versus countercurrents that grab the reader's imagination, such as our response to Willoughby being more energetic and interested than our responses to either Brandon or Ferrars. That I feel like, I'd have to go back and watch our videos, but I felt like we, even though we're not Austen scholars, we were kind of like saying some stuff similar to what Poovey had to say. So I don't know if hers is my favorite, but she was writing stuff that made me go, oh, I remember when Chris said blah, 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 and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, and I'm going to circle back to a point you made earlier and say, I think, not diving super deep into that context is a totally understandable move. I did a very glossy reading of it myself, partly because I kind of feel like I have a sense of the context. Certainly not, at the kind of micro level that somebody like Claudia Johnson has, but I felt like I had a pretty good sense of the context, the context, and and at least the kind of, broadly woven sort of ideas about, what was sort of on people's minds in 1790, 1800. So I don't know that's actually a super important bit of reading in this moment. Although I think there are, especially that Edmund Burke. He is somebody, and we're both Americanists,
Right.
but Burke is somebody who I often see pop up in places where I don't always expect him.
Yeah.
If I'm doing any kind of meaningful research, which I should say for me usually means doing that kind of who's the French theorist who talked about the bifurcated vision, where you're seeing kind of micro and macro at the same time.
Yeah.
But anyway, where I'm looking at that, when I get to the macro stuff, I'm kind of shocked at how often Burke
Still.
sort of reappears. And I think a lot of it had to do with that kind of like, the Burkean man, as they say, being an important part of how, especially early sort of writers and thinkers in America, thought about the American character. But
Well, and the tension between Burke and Paine
yeah,
crosses Britain and America so well, and there's so much transatlantic thought, and
Right.
since the stuff we work on in our scholarship tends to be old stuff. Not that
True.
we don't dabble in recent things, but like you work on late 19th, early 20th century Southern literature. I tend to work on like mid 19th century, just Americanist stuff, and there's like a lot of Brit stuff still floating around in that way of thinking, and Burke and Paine and the sort of disagreements, I guess, between them are at the heart of a lot of that. Really it comes down to like classic conservatism versus classic liberalism, which to our 21st century minds almost feel like they've merged into the same thing because we've moved the window so much. But I agree with you that Burke shows up
a
ton.
So I think that's kind of an interest, just to kind of tack that on. I think that's kind of an interesting use, and if some weird opportunity arose that I was going to teach Sense and Sensibility to a group of undergraduates, I think it might be the case that I would actually want to start with some of that context.
Yeah, sure.
And spend a week or two on that. Because I think understanding some element of that is pretty useful. But then the criticism, I have to admit, some of this didn't move me a whole lot.
Right.
It's all interesting enough in its way, but I didn't really feel like some of it was opening up the novel as much as it might have. And part of that, I should say, is I think, and this is something that I have pondered for at least a couple of decades now, kind of when I look back on my undergraduate self, first encountering kind of professional literary criticism, I remember kind of thinking, like, if it made sense, then it wasn't worth reading. In a way, because I might have come up with that.
Right.
I wouldn't have known that it tied to Edmund Burke. I wouldn't have known that it landed, in this tradition of landscape, philosophy or architecture or whatever. But I might have read this and thought the same thing. And in my kind of youthful exuberance and arrogance and misunderstanding of the profession, I thought that meant that it wasn't really useful, right? That if somebody could just think that, then so what?
Right.
But I think that some of the things that I felt not especially moved by, I think maybe what I'm really registering there is that those things were so successfully sort of integrated into the world of literary criticism that I just take it for granted now that of course this is how it's like when I remember playing some Howlin' Wolf for a guy years ago who kind of had kind of recently discovered sort of Mississippi blues and wanted a kind of quick tutorial on what kind of stuff to listen to, and I played some Howlin' Wolf and he's like, oh, that guy sounds just like, and he named some pop guy from like 2002, and it's like,
right.
No. That guy
sounds like him.
Howlin' Wolf.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a little bit of that, that somebody like Raymond Williams is just so in the water,
Right.
that I'm unimpressed with him in part because I've already been inundated by
Yeah.
his ideas.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
much of that. But I do think Puvi just really brought some great heat.
Is that who you were thinking
I
of as well?
really like Puvi.
Yeah.
She was the first of the
Yeah.
sort of secondary critics who I kind of starred in my notes.
Yeah.
I pulled from 339. I thought right at the beginning of the second page of her
Yeah.
selection.
Oh, absolutely,
There's
yeah.
this kind of fascinating thing where she makes this argument. She's the most fundamental conflict. And in this case, she's talking about Northanger Abbey, but I think this is going to be, pretty general. The most fundamental conflict is between Austen's own imaginative engagement with her self-assertive characters and the moral code necessary to control their anarchic desires.
Yeah.
And one of the things I like about this, and partly this is because it kind of reflects a perspective that I think is close to my heart. This idea that there's a kind of systemic thing driving the way these characters behave. That this is not Thomas Paine's,
Right.
kind of like completely natural Rousseauian,
Right.
just because of the electrons in my brain, I do this.
Yeah.
But rather it acknowledges that there's this whole kind of structure of, everything from kind of influence to coercion that kind of suggests there's this way to behave at the same time that there are these, and I love this phrase, anarchic desires.
Yeah, and her essay, and well, and by the way, one pattern I noticed, I don't know, like I want to come back to Puvi, but in addition to Puvi, almost all the contemporary reviews that showed up in this criticism section, which I did read, and multiple authors did this thing that, it didn't surprise me as much as it just pleased me, I guess. That, like, evidently, one of the most famous moments in all of Jane Austen is that scene in chapter 2 where John Dashwood and his wife Fanny go from they're going to get 3,000 pounds to they're going to get nothing.
I'm going to give him some fish.
Yeah, the diminishing, like the way that the wife guides him from doing what his father asked to some fish every now and then has caught the imaginations of readers from Austen's own time all the way up into the 1990s, which is where this cuts off. And I can totally see why. I mean, I remember reading that conversation and being like, that could play on a Scandal Netflix show right now.
It's such a good rendering.
I mean, it's sexy, it's evil, it's
slightly understandable.
It's slightly understandable. It sets you up to care for Marianne and Eleanor in a way that before you've even met them.
Right.
It does everything that you want if you want to do like some kind of like dark moneyed drama, the kind of stuff that people are flocking to now, like with Succession and stuff like that.
Exactly.
And so Puvi paid attention to that right after your quote. Actually, she says. The dialogue between Mr. and Mrs. John Dashwood points up as surely as any overt narrative commentary the parsimony behind their dwindling goodwill.
Right. Well, and let me add to that, right, at the bottom of 339, almost every action in the novel suggests, this is Puvi again, that more often than not, individual will triumphs over principle and individual desire proves more compelling than moral law. And this idea that because what we're really seeing here is Puvi working within this structure that says, well, look, there's an entail, there's a will, there's all these legal documents.
But then there's what you want.
And then there's like your father's deathbed request.
Right. That goes with the other stuff. Yeah.
Right. And then these things kind of like maybe lock horns at some point, and your wife has a few things to say about it. And there's this very, I think, dark. I mean, she starts off, her whole thing is about how Sense and Sensibility is the darkest of the 1790 efforts. And part of that darkness, I think, is a very Christopher Nolan kind of like Dark Knight trilogy-esque. I'm really thinking of the reading of humanity that Heath Ledger's Joker offers. That like when times get tough, people will eat each other.
Yes, and
even when they're not so tough.
And then to celebrate Puvi a little more, and there are probably other articles we want to talk about, but her handling of Willoughby, I think was really effective. One thing that I really like that critics do now, that when I was in that phase you're talking about, I would look down on literary critics who would say things that were kind of obvious to me for much the same reasons that you're saying. Now, in my sort of August age, I kind of feel like it's almost fair to judge an academic article by, could a reasonably thoughtful person who read the novel read your article and get something out of it? You know, it's almost like my criticism of the MCU these days, right? Like, you watch one of these movies, and so often it's like, well, if you didn't see the 5 other movies, like, sometimes it's just gonna feel flat.
Too much homework.
And then people will say to you, well, you gotta watch this and this and this. And I just much prefer, you know, something that's gonna, like, get me right there. So, you know, she had some things to say about the way the novel plays not just on the dark impulses of a character like Fanny, but also with the reader. And I think what she's talking about here is not like your typical academic Austen scholar, but just people reading this frickin' book. And she says on page 340, stuff that you and I mentioned. And we were, let's be honest, this podcast, we bring academic context. It's what we do. But I think we're both just like kind of reading, like we were both like, holy shit, she's going to kill Marianne.
Right,
you know?
yeah.
So like we're trying to be just like enjoy reading again, really, is part of what this is. And Puvy says, on 2 occasions, when Willoughby is expected, but one of the more subdued lovers appears instead, the disappointment is unmistakable. So there it's like a formal disappointment. The energy leaves the room when they think it's Willoughby, and in comes one of the heroes.
Right.
And when the reverse situation occurs, in the climactic, we talked about this at length, and I wanted to really pick your brain on this. In the climactic final encounter between Elinor and Willoughby, Elinor is aroused to a pitch of complex emotion we never see Edward inspire in anyone. And I thought that was interesting because one of my favorite parts of our discussion of this novel was when you pointed out, as much of a cad as Willoughby is, and he certainly screwed Eliza over in a way that Elinor cannot forgive, and we cannot forgive. The novel's emotional peak is when Marianne is dying. And when Willoughby shows up after having drank beer, and he's confessing and pouring his heart out to Elinor, it almost doesn't matter that he's a cad. And I remember you saying, they're so emotionally, like, peaked in this moment that if this were real life, there would be a really good chance that the 2 of them would fuck. Like, you thought it was, if you remember,
Yeah.
like a really sexually charged moment, because Elinor was like, fuck this guy, but also, I gotta listen to this guy. Like, he's really feeling something
Right.
here, and they're both
Right.
distraught about Marianne. And Puvy got that, right? Like, when she says this more peaked emotion from Elinor than Edward ever gets, that's nice criticism on a level of just somebody reading the book
Right.
is going to feel that. You don't have to be an Austen expert or to have read Edmund Burke to get that,
Right.
you know?
Or to just notice, you know.
And this is part of why I think Puvy and other critics make such a big deal out of how lovers of Austen feel cheated by the end of the novel. And we complained about the end. They're like, the heroines are just kind of shunted off to these marriages that are like, okay, fine, I guess they're going to be fine. But it's like, especially Marianne, it feels like a betrayal, the men that they get, you know?
Well, and this...
So, yeah.
I don't want to sort of derail that, but this point you're making is something that ties in really well with the argument that Favre makes. I think that's how you say her name.
Okay, so this one, let's say for whoever's listening, Mary Favre?
Is it? Yeah, Mary Favre, I believe. Yeah.
373 in our edition.
Yeah.
Her
Sense and
article.
Sensibility, the letter post fashion.
Yes, that was a good one. Yeah.
Which it didn't tickle me as much as some of them did.
Yeah.
But this
Well,
idea that Eleanor is this kind of response to the epistolary, and I have to admit I'm a big fan. Maybe I should be embarrassed by this one. Big fan of like the 18th century epistolary novel.
Oh yeah, the Coquette is just like
Pamela,
unbelievable. Yeah,
all those,
Clarissa.
yeah.
I think Clarissa's epistolary.
Yeah, all of those I just think are kind of fascinating. They're readers reading, right? You know, it's like this text inside a text inside a text.
Yeah.
But this idea that Favre has is that you know the kind of denial, even though there are letters, the denial of Eleanor's voice in these letters is a way of keeping Eleanor's sort of internal consciousness internal.
Like
right.
like an almost assertion of modern notions of privacy.
Right, that she has this inner world that
Yeah.
we just will not have access to.
Yeah.
And then I think, this kind of speaks to, the ending that you're talking about, and the sort of disappointment or mystery at her apparent satisfaction with it, but also I think speaks to the kind of interesting, kind of like loud muted, that kind of like stunning, deafening silence that happens in the spaces during that Willoughby confession, where Eleanor is obviously feeling great big feelings, and struggling to manage them. And part of this, of course, is her sister is maybe dying.
Big part of it, yeah.
And, but also there's this whole world, kind of spinning around with Willoughby and with
Edward
Farrar
and his mom.
Right. And so this idea...
And Lucy's machinations have gotten under her skin.
Right. Yeah, and all the stuff.
Yeah.
And so there are these kind of suggestions that, that there are like serious wheels chugging inside her heart, inside her head. And I think, kind of spinning it back to Poovy's point about this moment, I think one of the strengths of that scene, and one of the reasons we keep coming back to it, and maybe somewhat the same reason, maybe somewhat connected, I should say, not the same, that we come back to this scene with Fanny and Mr. Dashwood, Mr. John Dashwood, is this kind of similar thing that, like, I think, I want to see Fanny as, she's literally, it's like Hansel and Gretel, right? It's literally, this kind of cruel stepmother.
Yeah.
But I think there's also this suggestion, this potential suggestion, and maybe I'm being too generous here, that she's just genuinely concerned about like her family's well-being, her son's well-being.
Although, just as I don't want to lose your point, but there was another critic, and I don't remember which one it was, that pointed out that estate would have been worth something of like upwards of $50 million.
Right, they would have been one of the 10 richest people in England or something.
And maybe I'll figure that out in a minute, which critic that was. But somebody broke down the money.
Yeah.
I think it was one of the men.
It was I want to say it was Gene Ruoff.
The will guy. So let's come back to that. But you're right that even though it's absurd, she is able to couch this argument in, well, I'm just looking out for my kid. Well, and so how are you connecting that to the Willoughby moment?
Well, this is what I want to say, and bear with me for a minute, because I think the structure that I'm seeing in these secondary critical readings is very similar to the exact thing that that Claudia Johnson says in the introduction. That I think the instinct I came to this novel with was to kind of think about things in opposition to each other, right?
Rather than the title literally says and. Yeah.
And partly because we have all this kind of obvious conflict in the first couple chapters with the entail, and we know that things are not going to go well for the Miss Dashwoods, at least in the beginning, and all that. But I believe I've seen this kind of pattern kind of repeating itself in the critical work, in that we have this kind of conflict. This ostensible conflict between sense and sensibility that I think is actually much more a kind of this and that, And the way that I break that down is with the Claudia Johnson piece about well, there's this kind of understanding of how things work, but then what this novel really does is puncture that. And we talked about this for sure when we were reading. What it really does is puncture this idea that says, like, no. The way this system works really is just to kind of I'm blanking on the word I'm looking for here, to kind of gratify the sort of avarice and greed and self-absorption of these patriarchs and these first sons, right? That there's this where's it on 345 in Johnson's. She says, when we read the novel, this starts at 344, when we read the novel exclusively as a discourse of female propriety, a quasi-allegorical representation of sense and sensibility, we overlook just how much material it devotes to the manners of men of family.
Yeah.
Right? And what I think she's trying to get at is this idea that, yes, there's this kind of overarching social narrative that says this is about women behaving the way they're supposed to behave. Because Eleanor is concerned about how Marianne's behaving.
Right.
All this kind of stuff. But I think, what Johnson very rightly points out is, the backdrop of that concern about women's behavior is a bunch of men behaving badly.
Well, and Johnson also pointed out how Eleanor, for all her fastidiousness to the moral code, cannot help but be blinded to the fact that Willoughby and Edward, like Edwards does almost all the same things, Johnson argues, that Willoughby had done. I mean, the only difference seems to be that, and this is a big difference, there is no doubt, that Willoughby got a woman pregnant and left her stranded. Mm-hmm. But you get every impression that the only reason that didn't happen to Edward was because of sheer luck. Yeah. Which again, like the Willoughby scene and like the convo between John and Fanny, makes this super modern. We all grew up around guys like that.
Yeah.
Guys that like accidentally became fathers at 18 and other guys that like went on to become medical doctors who could have just as easily gotten caught in that way. I mean, Johnson says at the end of that essay you're talking about, 348, as different as Edward and Willoughby are individually as English gentlemen, many of their failures are identical. In marked contrast to the Darcys and Knightleys of this world, they are weak, duplicitous, and selfish, entirely lacking in that rectitude and forthrightness with which Austen is capable of endowing exemplary gentlemen when she wishes. So this is reinforcing your point, and it makes me wonder why, and maybe we both know the answer to this, but it's like so easy, to dump all the blame on Willoughby and then also on Lucy. Mm-hmm. But Lucy's just playing a game under which she's pinned every bit as much as Eleanor is. Right. And as far as Willoughby goes, like, he's doing what guys do, in this world. Now, I know that if, in the universe of Pride and Prejudice, Darcy would say, well, that's not what all.
Right.
But that's kind of like the not all men argument against Me Too,
Exactly. Yeah, and so I think Johnson's argument pairs nicely in that same kind of like, is it versus or is it and kind of way with Isabel Armstrong. A little bit later on 364, who's making this argument about aesthetics, and let me just be the first to admit, I love me an argument about aesthetics.
Sure,
I think it is in some ways the backbone of all literary criticism, is just understanding what it means to pursue the understanding of aesthetics.
Yes,
and Armstrong's argument, I won't go into great detail. But basically her argument is that what sets the Dashwood women apart from almost everybody else in the novel is that they have a genuine, serious, intellectual interest in aesthetics.
They do, and in that way, she says they actually are both avatars of sense, more so than any of the other characters. Like, if you're looking at this through an aesthetic lens, I mean, so that's absolutely right.
And she says on 365, because they subscribe to the view, itself a political view, that taste belongs to the moral and social virtues which transcend wealth and class, legitimizing their poverty and exclusion. The politics, and this is where it gets really good for me, I think, the politics of the aesthetic are crucial for both girls. Right, this is Marianne and Eleanor.
Yeah.
The extent to which the aesthetic confirms the social order or enables a critique of it is at the issue of their debates.
Yeah.
And I think this is exactly that versus or and that the aesthetics, does it confirm the social order or does it open the social order up to criticism? And so I see that kind of that Johnson argument and the Armstrong argument as kind of following similar paths in the idea that it's like, well, one way to read this is that it's about this domestic space, but the other way to read this is that it's a sort of fundamental interrogation of these bigger social systems, aesthetics on one hand and sort of gender and family on the other. But then at the same time, I also pair up Poovey with the guy we mentioned earlier, Gene Ruoff, who, by the way, I did a little reading. I think Ruoff's was my favorite of the whole thing.
I love his title, just Wills.
Yeah, and I always think, I don't know how up you are on Lear, But there's that line that everybody debates where Lear is out in the storm, raging against the hurricanes.
Yeah.
And he just goes, blood, 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 blood.
Yeah.
And there's this kind of, as you know, I'm a big fan of prosody. I care a whole lot about that kind of meaning through meter kind of business. And there's this, as far as I can tell, raging debate still about how that line should be read metrically.
Yeah.
Where is the
How actors should perform it.
And where is what's the meter?
Right.
In general. In that sense, because there's several really good ways to think about it.
Yeah.
And so when Ruoff talks about that thudding repetition of will, which is just
It's a great literary criticism.
It's such a wonderful. This is like 350 something. Let me find it real quick.
It's on page 352. He's quoting, again, that scene in chapter 2.
Yes.
When Fanny is speechifying to John about leaving the girls out in the cold, and he just breaks down how many times the word will appears in that speech.
Right.
So I think the word thud that you were looking for begins with the last paragraph.
Yeah, and the next sentence after that quote, wills become purely willful, simple, arbitrary exercises of power.
Yeah.
And so what he's saying there is that the will, right, which is the vehicle for this entail, that in some ways is the MacGuffin for this whole story.
Mm-hmm.
That it's not this object of social order. It's not how we keep the lights on, right? It is it is simply arbitrary exercise of power.
That's right.
And I think that Puvi is kind of thinking about this when she makes this argument, or maybe not in exactly this way, but she's thinking about this when she makes this argument about individual will versus moral law, right, and that kind of thing. And in Puvi's case, I'm thinking about it in terms of Willoughby.
Yeah.
Right? I'm thinking about it in terms...
Which his first 4 letters of his name as well.
Right? I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about it in terms of Edward Farrar,
who's
like caught in what he thinks is this kind of like social bind where he's made a promise that he can't break, but he's also sort of broken it, but he's trying not to break it.
Yeah.
And a lot of it is just about, his own individual, desires kind of subverting what he thinks is his, what he pretends is his adherence to this social law or moral law. Yeah. And so what I really see playing out in this critical sort of section is a kind of repetition of Johnson's point. And I suppose she chose these secondary readings so that there must be some kind of family tree we could track down to explain this. But I really like the way that it for me it kind of creates this locus of concern around this kind of conflict of how to view it. But it doesn't have to be a conflict, right? We can read it as this novel of manners, this kind of Harlequin style,
Yeah, we need to talk about that essay, but
this Harlequin style thing. At the same time that we can acknowledge that there is this subtext that has to do with social order and the way that the law it becomes a vehicle for particular kinds of individual power and its expression.
Yes.
And I just very much like Ruoff's treatment of this. He was a longtime faculty at University of Chicago, I found.
Okay.
I was kind of moved to read. And I think I made no bones about being really interested in the money side of really all of the Austen stuff.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that really attracts me to Ruoff's argument is that he really just goes all in on this argument that this is a novel about inheritance. This is a novel about the kind of social structures for the propagation and conservation of family wealth, which I'm interested in for a lot of very kind of present reasons. That Bernie Sanders has a lot to talk about, for example.
Sure.
But I'm also interested in the way that this kind of seems to sort of maybe have its root in some of these concerns that I'm thinking of as relatively modern, relatively contemporary, seems to have roots that go back to 1790.
Yeah.
Where people are sort of asking the same question, just in slightly different ways. And a neat thing, one more thing about Ruoff that I'll say. That I was really impressed. He said in 350, he made this point about how, in the actual historical moment, this entail would almost certainly not have worked the way it does in the novel. That instead of wills, these things were handled by a different instrument, by deeds that would sort of kick in at certain sort of landmark moments, coming of age, getting married, something like that. And so one of the things that Austen has done in this book, by creating this situation with the entail, which, if I'm understanding Ruoff correctly, he reads as plausible but unlikely.
Yeah.
That she's created the situation that puts the Dashwoods at like maximum vulnerability.
That's right.
And so interestingly enough, what we have here is Jane Austen using the sort of legal instruments of social propagation in a way to create a narrative that allows us to understand that these legal instruments are not that, right? That they're simply a sort of cloak for these individual expressions of power that aren't really about the social good. They're not.
That's right.
They're not about keeping the car running, or whatever metaphor you want to use there. They're about this individual desire to bend will. And there we are at that word again.
Yeah. And we paid a lot of attention to that too, with like Mrs. Ferrars and the way she bullies her sons.
Right. Ruoff has some stuff to say about that.
Yeah,
too.
and so it's shot through the book, the economics, and I like your point about their vulnerability being maximized. I guess this is an okay moment for me to transition into my thoughts on the final essay that showed up in the criticism by Deborah Kaplan. Mass marketing Jane Austen, men, women, and courtship into film adaptations. And, obviously Johnson cuts out some of the things that Kaplan had to say about Pride and Prejudice, because the focus is in this one is Sense and Sensibility. But she points out, that by giving Hugh Grant and Alan Rickman the roles of Ferrars and Brandon, and then casting, I don't know even the guy's name, but like somebody Wiley or something like that, Greg Wise.
Yeah.
She's just sort of pointing out this thing like that I've seen before, where a lot of emphasis is placed on modern women readers and their responses to Jane Austen, specifically like a reader response that is also feminist. And I think that one of Kaplan's points that annoy her with this Ang Lee movie is that, she kind of captures it right here on part one of it right here on 406. Judgments of personal attractiveness are, of course, highly subjective. But the stage and film careers of Jeremy Northam, Hugh Grant, and Alan Rickman indicate that all have been widely understood to have at least as much romantic appeal as Greg Wise, who plays the role of Willoughby in the film. And she's like, okay, so there you violated much of the aesthetics of Austen's text right off the bat. Like in a way, this passage goes really well with Mary Poovy's argument that by making the winners as sexually interesting as Willoughby, you've ruined that whole tension about whether it's sense and or sense versus sensibility. You just ruined it, and so it bothers her. And the second point that really bothered her about it, that your comment about maximum vulnerability reminded me of, is that the movies, and she had some positive things to say about Ang Lee's movie, by the way, but she thinks that in general, it seems to me that she thinks in general filmic adaptations of Austen don't do enough of the work of honoring the relationships between women that Austen sometimes erects as a bulwark against that patriarchal mendacity.
She says that thing about thinning out the world.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm reminded of the great adaptation of Emma Clueless, which I'm going to want to talk about when we read Emma, because I thought that...
I'm going to have to rewatch that.
Yeah. God rest her soul. Murphy?
Brittany Murphy.
Brittany Murphy.
Yeah.
that was good on that level. But like here, you know, it's interesting. I mean, the maximization of the Dashwood girl's vulnerability economically is so counterbalanced by what feels to me as a reader of this super realistic sense that, okay, they're going to turn to each other. They may not always agree. One is more sensible, one is more feelingsy, but they do have this shared interest, as you say, in art and music, and they're trying to understand the world. But like also they throw themselves into each other's arms, you know, against the storm. And it seems to me that Kaplan's main point is, oh, you just kind of turned this into like a Harlequin romance story in the worst sense of the word. Like she doesn't even hate Harlequins, right? So I thought that was kind of a balanced article, that she wasn't saying, oh, you know, it's almost like she's saying, I get it. I like to eat popcorn and lust after men too, you guys.
Right.
But this is not the same thing as the books at all.
Yeah. Well,
you know.
Yeah, I thought that was sort of interesting. The last two essays were about different contemporary readerships, right? And what Kaplan was saying, and I've liked her work for years.
Yeah.
I mean, it's what a dumb thing to say in a way, right? Like, you know, it's this super successful critic is somebody I think.
But she's good. I mean, that's why she's
to say.
yeah.
But one of the neat things I think about Kaplan, and this kind of comes back to what we were saying at the very beginning, she's kind of suggesting that this treatment of Jane Austen in, 1992, was almost inevitable, right? The same way that me going at Raymond Williams, is almost inevitable, and it was because Jane Austen became the water that romance swam in.
Yeah.
By the time people were watching these movies, they knew they liked it because they liked the Harlequin romances that were born out of Jane Austen's sensibility. And so when Ang Lee makes this movie, or when anybody really makes this movie, one of the things they're doing is sort of, addressing both of the kind of versions of this text.
Yeah.
And that's just, of course it's gonna be too much and too little.
Right.
For somebody who's aware of both things.
Yeah.
But I think it's kind of interesting. Eve Sedgwick, what are you going to say about Eve Sedgwick in
Yeah.
general? But she's making a similar sort of strategic move when what she's saying, as I understand it, fundamentally boils down to contemporary readers in 1800 would understand that Mary Ann's problem is that she's an obsessive masturbator,
and that Sedgwick's, I guess the work that brought her alive to me was that Epistemology of the Closet book, like that I had to read for a theory class in grad school, and really liked that, and read it alongside Henry James, not Jane Austen.
Yeah.
But then this essay I kind of came to for the first time. The Jane Austen and the Masturbating Girl is the provocative title of that one.
Right.
That not only does Mary Ann masturbate a lot, but we're supposed to be given to understand that when she has her big breakdown about the letters, and Eleanor goes into the bedroom, that she has been in the middle of masturbating then. And I don't know if I read it correctly or not, but there seemed to be a suggestion that there was something erotic anyway about Eleanor's relationship with Mary Ann. That maybe even like not quite inappropriate, but on that line. And I don't know if I was reading that like onto the page or if that was there.
I didn't understand it to be inappropriate as much as it was just kind of like that as same-sex siblings, as heterosexual same-sex siblings, they could share a sort of sexual space without necessarily sexualizing each other. Is kind of how I understood Sedgwick to be talking about this. But what I found really interesting about it is this idea that, and at least the excerpt that I read, that we read, doesn't make it clear to me whether Sedgwick thinks that Austen is really, really consciously trying to enact
That's
this,
right.
or if it was just kind of in the air of the moment. She invoked these kind of hysterical, like I guess that's a weird word to use here, but that kind of hysterical tracks about women masturbating, and I'm reminded of that American pamphlet about the Devil's Doorbell here, but just the idea that that a contemporary reader, one of Austen's contemporary readers would be like, I know what's wrong with her, is an interesting thing. And it speaks to, I think, the same sort of thing that Deborah Kaplan is getting to, right? That a contemporary viewer in the 1990s is going to go, oh, I get this, it's this.
Yeah.
And the reason they do that is because of this social structure, this aesthetic social structure.
Well, like she said, I mean, directors are born of their moment. The actors are even their. Right. She brought up their diets, their weightlifting routines. It's like it's almost impossible to do period.
Right.
Movie.
Right.
Like
and the thing I'll add that I think Kaplan and Sedgwick both kind of take for granted.
Yeah.
Readers are also born of their moments.
That's right.
Right, and so they're gonna come to a text. What's this movie about? I don't know. A couple sisters are trying to get married. There's some sort of complexity. Okay, I know that story.
Yeah.
Right now, I don't know exactly what's going to happen, but I know the movements of this particular opera.
Yes.
And I know that there's going to be a cad. I know that he's either going to be redeemed or completely ousted by the guy who becomes the husband. I know the versions of this story in this kind of Jungian Joseph Campbell way.
Yeah.
And Sedgwick, I think, is kind of suggesting that in 1791 a reader might have landed on this, or it was later than that, whatever the date was. A reader might have landed on this and said, "Oh, I also know this story," and what an interesting sort of now.
Well, doesn't she quote pamphlets from the time?
So she's very concerned.
So she gives receipts.
Yeah,
she's like, "Listen, people were talking about women masturbating, and here's the language they used, and look, here's the same language in Nelson's book."
Yeah, and my sense is, not to make this kind of whatever, but my sense is that what that conversation is, those pamphlets, in the 1750s, 1760s, I think, what this really is a very recognizable thing that we see periodically throughout history, where, women get uppity. Women start demanding things like financial independence or, sovereignty over their own bodies, or things like that. And the masculine, dominant culture diagnoses this and says, "Oh, they're sick. This is what's going on."
Right.
Or there's some externality. Like, I think the version of those pamphlets, and I'm sure you see this on social media the same way I do. The version of these pamphlets, I think, right now in 2023, is this idea that somehow OnlyFans has turned every woman into a porn star, and it's tearing great holes into the fabric of society, and we're never going to recover.
And then it's paired with, on the masculine side, which I think is bifurcated in ways that also resonate with Sedgwick. On the one hand, there is this incel movement, where it's like men are especially horrified at women's sexuality because it's like, maybe it was Ice Cube or Eazy-E that once said, she's a bitch if she sleeps with everyone but me, or something like that. And there's some of that going on. But there's also, on the more like Burkean side of the fence, like I'm thinking about people like Dennis Prager or Michael Reagan. For all I know, perhaps Mitt Romney would say something like, well, what's really happened is that men have shirked their manliness. They're no longer viable options for women because they've gone soft.
Skinny jeans.
They've gotten feminized, and now women are left sexually hysterical because, there are no good men left. Right. So that is absolutely a thing that's happening right now. Both of those arguments are going on, neither of which are willing to grant agency to just your average woman. One of the lines I liked from the last season of Succession is when Shiv is speaking at her father's funeral, and she says, it was tough to be his daughter. I don't think that he ever knew how to fit a whole woman in his head. And I think that some of the critics are getting at that in this, and I think Sedgwick is definitely getting at that with those pamphlets.
Yeah.
So, like, they just didn't know how to even deal with it. So she must be sick, as you say.
Yeah, and so I think not to go on and on about this, but I will say I find Sedgwick's reading interesting. I don't find it as comprehensively compelling as Ruoff
Right,
or
right.
as Puvis.
Right.
But I think that's because she's playing a different game here, and I don't mean to denigrate. When I say game, what I really mean is she's pursuing a different strategy.
She's doing something else, yeah. Well, she's interested in subconscious.
Yeah.
I mean, she operates in this Freudian tradition.
Right.
Whereas I would say that the lion's share of Johnson's choices are the people that set the stage for grad school for us. They're new historicists.
Yeah,
I mean, we were
absolutely.
raised. Dana, my wife and I were joking about this the other day. It's almost like our generation was just raised on new historicism to such an extent. Like when you
We can't see
encounter
it
a
another
Freudian argument like
Yeah.
Sedgwick's,
Yeah.
it's like some exotic animal out in the wild. But in
Right.
her moment, and even like Camille Paglia and all those
I was
folks,
totally going to just bring her up. Yeah.
that was like what you did. And,
Well,
it's a cycle. It swings back
Right.
and forth, and then goes in different directions.
Well, that-
I don't think new historicism is dominant anymore.
No,
I think there are
No.
other kinds of things that play. Intersectionality, I think.
Post-coloniality.
Yeah.
But what I'll add to that, I was thinking of Camille Paglia, just even
Yeah.
as you said the name, I was thinking about her.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that's going on there that's of a moment is that women like Sedgwick and women like Paglia, who overlap quite a bit.
Yeah.
And to some
Although they did not like each other, I don't think.
but their work
Yes.
kind of rubbed
Yes.
against each other a lot. And I would add to that, although I think she's a slightly different thing, Susan Sontag.
That's right.
I think one of the things that they were really trying to do was this kind of version of public intellectualism that bordered on kind of activism, maybe even a kind of intellectual terrorism, in the sense that they where Puvi is like, this is really interesting and I want to understand this. I think people like Sedgwick and even more so Paglia were like, the world is messed up,
Yeah.
and I'm going to set things on fire until you notice.
Yeah.
And I think part of Sedgwick's strategy of calling it the masturbating girl
Yeah.
and writing about this kind of really explicit sexuality in Jane Austen is to unsettle people. Her point is to be kind of dramatic and performative. And I'm not saying that as a criticism. I'm just saying it's a different strategy than what these other critics are doing.
And what I love about it is, she shows like how brilliantly different theoretical frameworks can be brought to bear. Because yes, it's a Freudian reading and a sexually charged reading that is meant to scramble your brain, but she also makes the new historicist move of, again, showing her receipts. Like, she gives all those pamphlets and she's like, well, y'all, here's what people were reading.
I didn't make this
like,
up.
listen, they were
Right.
reading this, and then the words line up. So
Yeah.
it's interesting to me, and I mean, I think that one of the things that makes Austen so alive to me in Sense and Sensibility, because I had never read it before. Unlike Pride and Prejudice, when we came to that, it was really my third time through, although it had been 20 years. It's just the books have depth, and I mean, even though I didn't love the ending, I love how it's got class and what we would call Marxist issues in it. It's got Freudian sexual issues and sexual tensions in it. It's got political context. It's got straight up legal context. And so, the fact that you can attack it from all those different ways is part of what makes it fun. I mean, notwithstanding, Kaplan's essay, which I think had as much to do with the reader response actually as anything else. Like, she's like, listen, women see this movie and they're just going to go, sorry, y'all, just to take off my academic hat for a second, she's saying, they're going to look at Hugh Grant and go, oh, Hugh Grant, even though, but he just had that scandal that I'm watching on E.
Yeah.
And she's like, that's just happening, y'all. Whether we can intellectualize this all we want, but that's what's happening in this movie. So I dig the depth. I think you're right. Johnson marshaled this in a way that ultimately reinforces her fascination with the title.
Yeah.
And the implications of the title. But she also shows off a range of ways of looking at it that testifies to the goodness of the book.
Yeah.
I would say.
I 100% agree. I wasn't expecting anything we read in this to really change very dramatically my sense of the book. But I will say I feel, and I guess this is maybe my final my final point in this particular conversation, but I feel somewhat gratified that while the critical, apparatus opened up certain perspectives a little bit more, ultimately what it did is really kind of confirm the value of my approach for me, while certainly not trying to say that there aren't other valuable approaches, but it kind of validated, I should say, that the relatively cold, relatively unencumbered by knowledge feeling that I had after reading this book, kind of fits in with a lot of what these professional lifelong readers of Austen had to say, which in some ways, in a very egotistical way, I think I find really comforting. It suggests that I'm doing something right when I look at this book, but also I think allows me to kind of understand the weight of my own response a little bit, in the sense of how it says something, and maybe this is again that question of aesthetics, that it helps me learn a little bit more about why it is that I want to read the book this way, in terms of my own sense of aesthetics and social contract and legal apparatus.
That to me is always, I think, my favorite thing about reading literary criticism, or even reviews of like TV shows and movies in real time on the internet. A lot of times you really can learn things about why you liked or disliked something. And it tells you a little bit about who you are. And I mean, gosh, if there isn't something like that going on in an analysis of a work that, after all, is meant to transmit, it would be different if we were only reading diaries here. Right. But we're not, right? Like, we're reading there was one passage I wanted to call attention to from the epistolary article before we go.
Yeah.
That I just thought was a really nice sentence. And there was your the one you brought up, which article was it now?
This is Favret.
Yeah. Mary Favret on 373. She had a sentence in here that, just as a standalone sentence, I thought was really cool. That may not have as much to do with Austen as it does to do with my sense of things being a cycle. When she's talking about. It's on page 381. These two sentences, I guess. Although Austen replaces the interiority of the epistolary novel with a safer, less constraining model of narration, she cannot replace the social connection, the personal correspondence which the letter once promised. In its hour of glory, the letter, in fiction, created an interpenetration of consciousness between readers and writers, which has rarely, if ever, been repeated. And I guess I want to say, as we close out today's thing, that she published this in 1993. And I'm far from the last person to notice this, but a lot of critics in our own moment have pointed out that as novels and movies and literature absorb the culture of digital tech more and more, there's a circular aspect now. I mean, when you see entire narratives now carried by texting and by social media posts and commentary, like Gary Steingart's Super Sad True Love Story, for example. The epistolary novel is back.
Yeah,
I would point that out. That sense of interiority has once again been exploded, and I find that to be. I wonder what Austen would think about that.
Well, Sleepless in Seattle is having an anniversary.
Yeah, and even You've Got Mail was like that. Yeah,
right. And I was thinking about that in the context of the Benedict Cumberbatch Sherlock.
Yeah.
Which does a lot with texting, visually as well as narrative.
Yeah.
So. Yeah, there's a lot of good stuff there, and I'm glad that we've done this extra dive, and I hope we go back and do the same thing with
Pride and Prejudice
before too long.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think it's another one of those kind of dumb obvious things, but I guess I'll say it anyway. I think there's just a lot of value in sort of taking a minute, letting the novel kind of age and ferment, and then going back and looking at other people's ideas about it. To really kind of, I think, liven its place in our consciousness, and really to think about, what all that really can mean.
Yeah.
I think it's really important.
I think that's a great way to close it out.
Excellent.
Long live Sense and Sensibility.